What is up, Steeler fans? It is Monday. It's time for the Monday morning conversation. And I have a guy that actually used to work with me way back in the day, way back in the day, Nick Farabaugh, back with Behind the Steel Curtain. What's up, Nick? How are you?
Yeah, how are you doing, Jeff? Thanks for having me on, man. I appreciate it.
No problem. It's crazy how things pan out. Nick Farabaugh now at PennLive.com. He's a beat writer. He's become a very strong voice in the Steelers community. I'm glad that he's taken the time to join the show. I want to start off by looking backwards before we start looking ahead, because the new league year is quickly approaching. In your opinion, you're in that locker room every single day. You're around players, you're around coaches. What, in your opinion, happened at the end of 2024? And of course, they lost 5 straight games to end the season, but what exactly was the root cause? Can you pinpoint anything?
I mean, I think it just caught up to them. I think we saw more close to what the team was than what it wasn't. I thought, we can talk about coaching, which I think has fallen short a lot of the time. I think their predictable defensive scheme. I think their running game is specifically also tied to a poor run scheme for what Jalen Warren and Najee Harris do and for what the offensive line does. I don't think they're very catchy in terms of what they do as coaches. I also thought there was more of a lack of buy-in the further we got into that stretch. I don't think at the start of the stretch necessarily, but once you got to Cincinnati, second Baltimore game, you started to see, I think, a little bit of lack of buy-in from the players. Like you saw a little questioning, like, what are we doing here? I remember the first Baltimore game when they lost that game. That blitz game was supposed to be a blitz heavy game plan for the Steelers defense, and that never happened. And a lot of players were wondering why that didn't happen. It was completely different from what they had done during the week. Miscommunications were popping up. I just think there was a few things that popped up, right? I think coaching was a big one, because how can you not fix miscommunications in your secondary in week 16, week 17, week 18, and then a playoff game? And then
Right.
how could you not fix the run game bus that had been happening all year on the offensive side of the ball, right? They would have something blocked up really well, and then one guy would just whiff on his block or block the wrong guy, and it's a loss of 2 or a gain of 2 instead of 10, 15, 20 yards. We've just seen that so many times. And so coaching, I think, was a big part of it. I think Russell Wilson came back down to earth. He played really well, through those first 4 or 5 games, really through that first Cincinnati game. Even even through the second Cleveland game, he was fine. And then I think we saw it kind of come back down to earth a little bit. And then I think you just saw the flaws offensively exposed, right? You saw the young offensive line start to look like a young offensive line a little more as more tape got put out on them. You saw the lack of wide receiver, I think, help outside of George Pickens when he was hurt, and then even when he came back, really pop up. And so there's just a calamity of issues. I think coaching was a big part of it. I think the lack of game plan adjusting was a big part of it. I also think it showcased a lack of talent on the offensive side of the football. And so I think all of those kind of swirled into one, came together, and that's really why they lost 5 straight. I don't think that team is as bad as that 5-game losing streak. I also don't think they're as good as their 10-3 start. So ending up at 10-7 is probably right around where they should be anyways.
That's fair. That's fair. I want to go back to something you said, though, and you talked about how people started to question. It's natural. I've always said this. When teams winning, when a team is 10-3, it's easy to stand in front of the media, answer questions. You're laughing, you're joking, everyone's having a good time. But when things start to turn, how do you handle that? Now, I totally saw what you saw, and this is from an outsider's perspective. Did you see, though, some of the questioning? Did that start to snowball? Like, did it start to become worse and worse as this losing streak continued and as the playoffs progressed, or was there a calming force in the locker room, whether it's Mike Tomlin, whether it's players? How did they handle that?
Yeah, no, I think it did. I think the schematics of it all never made sense to some of these players, particularly down the stretch, because they didn't really change much, right?
Right.
They just
Yeah.
kind of kept rolling out the same ball, and it was kind of like, what are we doing, right? We're not changing a significant amount of things. And so when you kind of get into that, things do kind of snowball. Now, I don't think their morale took a hit. I think that they were still very much there in terms of effort. I think they were there in terms of their buy-in to Mike Tomlin's message specifically. I know some people are like, did Mike Tomlin lose the locker room with his messaging? I didn't ever get that sense. I think that they still very much listen to Mike Tomlin. But I also think they looked at some of the game plans that were being rolled out there. And I mean, on defense, how many times can you run spot drop cover 3 with rushing 4 right behind it? Like, they did it all the time. I think they did the most in the league last year. And their changeup was to go cover 1-man coverage. They didn't really do a ton of switch ups. And when they did do switch ups, it went terribly, right? When they started to kind of put it in, that's when the miscommunication started happening. It was,
Right.
oh, we can't even run basic cover 2. We can't run quarters because someone's busting coverages. Someone's blitzing wrong. We know we didn't send a blitz on this, but someone decided to blitz, or the wrong guy blitzed. And we had 2 guys blitzing instead of 1 guy. And there were just so many bad things that happened. I think the offense kind of came back down to where it was. They lost their best playmaker in George Pickens. We saw Russell Wilson just kind of go from up here to come down here, right? The 50-50 balls and start hitting. The offense, I think, had its talent problem exposed, along with people kind of knowing Arthur Smith was just, he's an okay OC. He's not an outright bad offensive coordinator, but he doesn't do a ton of lifting, right, of the talent, I think. And so we saw a lot of that exposed. I think defensively is where we saw the coaching exposed between the predictable defensive scheme, which I think kind of wore on some of those guys as it went along. And I think the biggest thing was they went into the season with a bit of arrogance with them. They saw the talent they had amassed with adding Patrick Queen, with Cam Hayward being back to full health. They had seen the absolute excess of talent on that defensive side of the ball and thought they could just line up and play basic cover 3 and cover 1 and be okay. And they learned very quickly once they got into the second half of the season that wasn't going to be the case. They had to pivot. They hadn't worked on stuff that they were running late in the season since training camp and practice, and it went disaster. It was a disaster. Went disastrous. So I think that is all kind of tied in together. And so I don't think the messaging snowballed, but I do think the buy-in specifically from the defensive side of the ball definitely did.
So even from a layman's perspective, even someone that doesn't know the X's and O's as well as someone like yourself, we saw this. You could see the scheme. You saw the open scripts on offense just continue to fail. You saw defensive miscommunications with the players throwing their hands up and like, but what are you all doing? Let me follow that up with, how surprised were you that the Steelers have gotten rid of no one on the offensive side of the football, and on the defensive side, Aaron Curry leaves, and then they get rid of, or they bring in Gerald Alexander, and that's it. Were you expecting bigger changes in the coaching staff, especially as you talk about the schematic issues they had?
I mean, I didn't expect many on the offensive side of the ball. I thought
Yeah.
maybe Pat Meyer, but that's it. I didn't expect, because right, Zach Azzani, Tom Arth, and Arthur Smith are all new. They basically
Right.
had turned over that staff. And I mean, when's the last time you saw the Steelers dart after 1 year of a coach? It's very rare, right? Adrian Clem, I think, is the last one I could think of where they let him go to Oregon.
Yeah.
But it's very rare for them to do that. So I didn't expect the time. I thought maybe they would move on from Pat Meyer, but we know how much they don't like to move on from guys with contract, with
Right.
the time still left on their contract. Pat Meyer still has 1 year, so he's back. And I also think, part of why they didn't move on from him was, okay, look at what Frazier and McCormick did. They came in, they played well as rookies. Okay, that's their justification. I'm not sure I agree with it, but it is their justification. The
Right.
defensive side of the ball, I don't know. I thought maybe, they would move on from Terrell Austin. I thought that was a little surprising. I thought that would happen just because of what we talked about, right? The lack of buy-in. It's Mike Tomlin's defense at the end of the day. He does oversee that operation. It's his kind of blueprint, but Terrell Austin does enact that on a day-to-day basis, right? Mike Tomlin's kind of the macro overseer, but who's the guy that kind of goes in and teaches that and kind of pinpoints it week to week? That's the guy that does. And so I thought, okay, maybe Terrell Austin would leave, but he didn't. He still has a year left on his deal. So I mean, I guess I was a little surprised by that. I thought maybe you would see 4 or 5 changes. We only got 2.
Yeah.
Grady Brown and Aaron Curry being the changes, little surprising to me. Those are your 2 up and coming coaches. I thought that was surprising in some respects, but I also think the coverage bus, the basic things failing at the secondary and at the linebacker position are probably why they let those 2 go. So we saw those coverage busts into week 15, week 16, week 17. I think that ultimately cost those 2 a contract renewal in Pittsburgh, and it's probably why they went out and got guys like Scott McCurley and Jerry Alexander, 2 guys that are really known for emphasizing communication, being great communicators and teachers in that respect. So I imagine that is why those 2 were made. But I am a little surprised that they didn't make more, but I didn't expect this crazy sweeping
Right.
change along the coaching staff.
That's fair. Okay, so we've talked about what happened. Thank you for giving your insight from being inside the locker room and things like that. Let's look ahead. And I feel personally, you may disagree, that the Steelers are kind of in a really bad rut right now. Some people call it purgatory, whatever you want to call it, doesn't matter. The rut that they're in is that they don't have an established quarterback. And there are some holes, some larger than others, on the current roster that need to be filled. My question for you is, if you were to kind of lay out there a plan for how the Steelers can get themselves out of this rut as quickly as possible, what would that look like?
I mean, it's tough, right? Strike lightning with the quarterback out of nowhere is probably the answer, but as we know, the 2025 class is not a good one.
Right.
Um, and if you look at it really, what's going to happen is just what happened at the end of the Killers Bees era. They're putting so much draft capital into the offense. If they hit on offensive players, by the time that offense is ready to cook, Cam Hayward, TJ Watt, and Minka Fitzpatrick might be done. And so you might just be kind of flipping the script, right? We very easily could be at 2027, which is 2 years from now, and say, well, the offense is great, but man, that defense sucks again. And it's
Yep.
because we kind of have had this topsy turvy thing happen over the last, I don't know, decade or so, where offense is great, defense is great, but then the other side just is terrible, right? And
Right.
so the quickest way, if you're really talking about it, if you think the Steelers can win a Super Bowl, is you either have to make a big swing at a quarterback that is a veteran and is open on the trade market. There's really no one like that. Matt Stafford's the closest guy to that, but he's not even like Matt Stafford doesn't make them a Super Bowl contender to me. They're not a quarterback away. And so I think at some point you kind of got to look at the roster and be like, is it time to trade TJ Watt? Is it time to trade Minka Fitzpatrick? Is it time to tear it down to studs at some point just to line it up? Now they don't have to be outright bad. And listen, if they believe TJ Watt has 4 or 5 more really good years in him left, then it probably lines up with their timeline. It just edge rushers usually aren't elite until they're 33, 34. And Minka Fitzpatrick is kind of already starting to show some signs of decline. Cam Hayward's got maybe 2 years left. I don't expect him to play past his current deal. And so you're kind of in this tough rut where the offense is still sputtering in kind of its wake. And so the best way they can do it, which is what their current approach is going to be, because let's be real, what I just outlined is they're not going to trade TJ Watt. They're not going to trade Minka Fitzpatrick. They're not going to trade anyone that is a cornerstone on the defensive side of the ball. So with their current plan, I think their best hope is QB proof the offense, which is let's build the wide receiver room up. Let's continue to build the trenches. Let's get that explosive running back. And then on the defensive side of the ball, get young on the defensive line, get the corner room reinvigorated. And then next year, go up and get your quarterback. That's kind of what I think is their realistic path. Because let's be real, as I said, they're not going to trade their superstars on defense, even if that could net them significant draft capital, which could maybe reignite this rebuild very quickly. They are not going to do that. And so I think their best way is add receivers, add more on the O line, add a running back, fix the D line, fix the corner room. And next year, hopefully, you have the team set up in a spot where you can go up and make that swing at quarterback. And boom, you have a lightning young quarterback, and all of a sudden, your window's right there.
All right, so this may sound counterintuitive to what you just said, but what are your thoughts on the team's future with George Pickens? I agree with what you said about TJ Watt and Minka Fitzpatrick, that while I would be okay if they decided to shop those guys and get as much as they could for them, I understand why they wouldn't. But George Pickens is different. He's entering the last year of his rookie deal. I think a lot of people would say that he seems to be a headache. I'm not in the room, so I can't say whether that's fact or fiction. How do you see them handling that? You think he gets on the trade block?
Yeah, I think that's a tough one. One, I don't love I know people in the media are pumping up this wide receiving group in free agency. I don't love it as much as they do. I think there are questions about pretty much everyone up and down the board. Even Chris Godwin, who's probably the top guy. What is he coming off the ankle? Devontae Adams is 32. Um, and so George Pickens is you're in a tough spot with George Pickens because to trade George Pickens, you have to create leverage that makes him expendable. Right
Right.
now, he is not expendable. You trade him, your already bad offense is atrocious. We saw what it looked like without him. It's not pretty with him, and without him, it's even worse. And so you have to create your own leverage. So you have to somehow find a loophole here to rebuild an entire room that's going to get more expensive. So if you trade George Pickens, you're going to have to sign or trade for two guys, plus probably spend your first round pick on a wide receiver. Just a lot of resources to put into one position group when we have been talking about running back, corner, D line, right? All these different things that they want to address. It's hard to do that in the scope of trading George Pickens. It's just hard to rebuild a room in one offseason like that, like a receiver room where it's so expensive to put together the pieces and kind of piecemeal things together. And so what I'm trying to get at is, while I don't think George Pickens has a long-term future right now with the Steelers, I don't think they're going to extend him. They're going to give him an opportunity probably to prove it again in 25. We'll see what happens if they go and tell him we're not going to extend you. Does he request a trade? Does he hold in? Does he hold out? What happens? But I think that's what they're going to do, because I don't think they want to rebuild this room in one offseason. It's just there's only so many resources. There's only so many players that are going to be long-term options in that free agency market, because it's mostly aging veterans. And so by trying to trade George Pickens, you essentially put the wheel at wide receiver in a rut. You know, with George Pickens, at least you can project, okay, he maybe has another year, he gets better. You add a number 2, you add a number 3, you still have Calvin Austin, Roman Wilson. Cool. You have a framework here of how this can be a pretty solid room. Without him, I feel like you're really stretching yourself thin to rebuild a room that is hard, when I think they're going to have projects rebuilding the quarterback room, rebuilding the wide receiver room, rebuilding the defensive line room, rebuilding the cornerback room. I think they have 4 different rooms that they're going to want to go at and take multiple shots at, right? They're just going to try and rebuild. And I think it's just hard to put that much um, capital into a wide receiver, specifically in free agency and in the draft. So I understand why you would trade George Pickens. Again, he can't really be trusted week to week. And you would, I don't even know what they would get for him. Third round pick, I think. I don't think they'd get a second. I think they'd probably get a third for him. But I also think it's just hard to see them getting better offensively in the kind of vision of, oh, we're going to trade George Pickens.
All right, before I ask you some questions about the free agent dollars that they have to spend, I want to ask just really your own gut reaction, your opinion on what the Steelers both maybe could or should do at the quarterback position. Because really, and people talk about free agent wide receivers and who they could potentially bring in. If they don't make a deal with a quarterback that's currently that was on their roster last year, as a free agent wide receiver, is their agent going to say, let's go to the team without a quarterback? Like that's got to be a hard sell. How do you see the Steelers figuring out what they want to do at quarterback? Who do you think's the front runner? Are there any players that you think are probably more likely, I should say, to be the next quarterback for the Steelers in 2025?
Yeah, I mean, I think Justin Fields is probably the front runner right now, and it makes sense. He's probably not going to cost as much as a Russell Wilson. You're not going to have to pay him like Sam Darnold, and you probably only going to have to pay him, I don't know, 2 years, 30 million. That's 15 every year. Not only can you get out of that deal next year, but you at least have a quarterback under contract next year and
Right.
a bridge option. And I think he's young, so he has the potential. I don't necessarily think he's going to be, but he has the potential to be that Geno Smith, Baker Mayfield, Sam Darnold quarterback next year, right? Where he has his breakout year and boom, you have at least a long-term option now. I think that is the appeal of a Justin Fields, and the fact that not only does he allow you to be more financially flexible, but he actually has upside to be something of a long-term answer. Like, I don't think Russell Wilson has that. I don't think Kirk Cousins has that. Aaron Rodgers certainly does not have that. Even Matthew Stafford, who I think as we've kind of talked about, they're kind of in this weird spot where I guess their best option right now is, if they wanted to say we want to be a Super Bowl champion next year, their best option would probably be to trade for Matthew Stafford if they're not going to move all these pieces, which they're not going to do. But realistically, when we're talking about a 2-year step plan of where we kind of see this franchise trying to break out and become what they think they can be, is okay. Justin Fields makes sense because he has the upside to be a long-term answer, and he's not going to break the bank for you. And the cool thing is, if you get him on that 2-year deal, right? Let's say he has that Sam Darnold year, you have him under contract for another year, so you can negotiate with him next year, extend him long term. You're kind of out of quarterback purgatory in some way. So I do think Justin Fields is probably their best option. In terms of that, I do think that he at least gives them an eye towards the future, which I think they have to have some view of in this offseason. It can't just be what can we do for 2025. I think they have to look at 2026, 2027 in some regards to their decision making this offseason. It has to have some future in mind because we've seen them go now since Ben Roethlisberger tore his elbow ligament in 2019, right? We saw it in 2021 where they just sold out drafting Najee Harris and getting all these pieces together for one final run with Ben Roethlisberger. And then we saw them do it the past few years. So my guess is Justin Fields is probably the front runner. And I think logically, he makes the most sense for them.
Yeah. Now, I just go back to the coaching staff for a second, because I think if Justin Fields is the quarterback, the people that might be thinking about Justin Fields in 2024, I don't think the offense would look exactly the same, because they would have a whole offseason to tailor a system that's more to his strengths and his athleticism. My question for you is, do you think Arthur Smith is the type of coordinator that is going to be capable of putting together a plan that would best suit and accentuate his strengths and decrease his weaknesses?
Well, listen, I'm not a huge Arthur Smith fan, but I have to give him credit. He has done it before. He did do it with Ryan Tannehill, and that
Right.
team did go to the AFC Championship game. Now they had AJ Brown and they had Derrick Henry, which is a lot more. It's a lot different
Yeah.
than what the Steelers have. However, there are, as we mentioned, there are at least options out there at wide receiver. Maybe they could make a swing on a guy, find someone that is a bit of a hidden gem, or they land Devontae Adams, or they land Chris Godwin, right? And all of a sudden, you land Chris Godwin or Devontae Adams, and boom, you have two legitimate 1-2 types. And okay, there you have your receiver room. And then running back is going to be the question. Can you get an explosive back in there with Jalen Warren? I think that's going to be the question. Can they get explosives on the ground? So it's hard, right? Because the infrastructure that we've seen with those three quarterbacks is not currently built in Pittsburgh. I mean, you look at the commonalities between Baker Mayfield, Sam Darnold, and Geno Smith. The wide receiver talent's great, right? Justin Jefferson, Addison.
Yep.
In Minnesota, you had DK and Lockett with Geno, and then you had Godwin and Evans with Baker. You have George Pickens and who, right? Now, maybe you
Right.
can find one. So maybe you can, if you draft a receiver in the first round, maybe that guy is the next instant star. That could be one of them. You had the running game kind of in both areas. In all three places, the running game was at least there, right? Less so in Tampa Bay. Their running game, even under Canales, was a little out there at times. But they had the infrastructure and they had play callers that understood what to do. So they need to build that infrastructure. The offensive line has to take another step, right? They need to make sure Frazier, McCormick, and Fautanu and Broderick Jones, I think Broderick Jones especially, all four of those guys need to take steps forward, and this offensive line needs to become pretty legit. And so, you look at all those guys. Sam Darnold had a great ecosystem all across the board. Geno Smith mostly did. The O-line wasn't great. And Baker Mayfield had a really good ecosystem all across the board. Little less running game action, but he had such a great passing game coordinator in Canales that it was able to kind of work. And so the Steelers need to build up an infrastructure there. So they have to hit on some of these moves. But right now, it certainly doesn't appear that way. And we have seen Arthur Smith do it before, but he did it in a lot easier conditions when you have a
Right.
Hall of Fame running back, one of the best wide receivers in football, and A.J. Brown. But I will say, and if you're kind of doing devil's advocate here, in 2019 when that Tannehill resurgence started, who was their second round pick? It was A.J. Brown. So it can happen where you can maybe land a rookie receiver or land a veteran receiver, and all of a sudden there you go. Maybe you're starting to build something of a semblance there. But would I bet on Justin Fields being the next breakout guy because this is such a great OC and this is such a great surrounding cast? I would not.
Okay. Fair enough. Let's talk about free agent dollars here. The Steelers are going to have anywhere from 60 million to, depending on the actual number, and if they make a few more cuts, they could maybe get that number up close to 70, which is astonishing for Steeler fans. You talked about the rooms that kind of need to be rebuilt. Quarterbacks one, wide receivers another. Talked about the defensive front. You talked about cornerback. If you were allocating funds and saying, I'm going to take the free agent of like the maybe 50% of my free agent dollars, and I'm going to put it into this position because really I value the free agent crop more than I do the NFL draft crop, how would you allocate the funds into those rooms that you say need to be rebuilt?
Well, I think wide receiver and corner are the two very obvious positions that you should do it. Corner, especially. This I like this corner draft more than most people probably do, but this free agency group is great. You look at the guys that are out there from DJ Reed, Byron Murphy, Shavarius Ward, Asante Samuel Jr. There's just so many names out there, and that's only 4 or 5 of them. There are legit 10, 11, 12 guys that can make a difference. So corner is a big part of that. I think
Yeah.
you can address outside and slot corner and not even have to draft one necessarily because you already have your 2 young guys, I feel like, right? And you don't want to completely close off the vine for Corey Trice and Beatty Bishop, right? Those are 2 still young guys developing, and maybe they can become something. And so those 2 spots feel like to me easy upgrades in free agency.
Okay.
Wide receiver, even though I mentioned I'm not as high on the free agency crop, this class is just not as good as previous wide receiver crops. It's just not as deep. The day 2 guys are not, you're not going to find a George Pickens at 52, for example, right? You're not going to find a guy that talented, even with the concerns George Pickens had coming out of Georgia, that's going to fall that far. There's just not as many guys. And so you're going to want to, I think, sign 1 or 2 guys at wide receiver in free agency. And so I think that's going to be their best path towards upgrading that room. I also think defensive line is a little bit of an interesting one here. I know the draft is historically deep at defensive line. It is one of the best defensive tackle classes I can remember. But there's also some pretty good players out there in free agency. Milton Williams, Tershawn Wharton, Osa Odigizua, Javon Hargrave's probably going to get cut. There are guys out there that you could make swings on at defensive line. But to me, if I am Omar Khan, I am looking at the crop of free agents compared to the draft strengths and saying corner and wide receiver. And then I would go into the draft looking at running back, defensive line, and wide receiver heavily. Those 3 positions, I think you can make a pretty good case. Those 3 positions should be your first 4-round picks, but you could also invest capital into them in terms of your free agency cap dollar spending. But wide receiver, cornerback would be my focus, and maybe a splashier defensive line.
It's good stuff, man. It's going to be exciting to see what the Steelers can do. Like I said, they have this crazy number of cap space, which I can't tell you the last time the Steelers had that much capital in terms of salary cap space remaining, and they can upgrade those rooms pretty quickly. But the NFL draft is going to be coming up, and I'd love to get your thoughts on that down the road. But for now, I know the free agency can change all that in a drop of a hat. So I just want to give you an opportunity to plug what you're doing. Nick, both, I know you got YouTube channel. I know you're obviously your written work. Go ahead and plug that, social media handles, you name it.
Yeah, make sure to follow me on Twitter at Farabaugh just my last name with FB. I'm tweeting over there all the time. Make sure to read stuff at PennLive.com. Got a ton of analysis, news, et cetera over there. And Steelers on Penn Live is the YouTube channel. Have a podcast bi-weekly over there. Just kind of talking about things, picking up the pace. So make sure to check all that stuff out.
Nick, I thank you for your time, man. Enjoy it. And I'm sure we'll be in touch again soon. Take it easy.
Thanks for having me on, man.